The morning Etta Leland found the man bleeding on her porch, she already had a rifle in her hands. She had heard the sound first, not a knock, not a cry, but something heavier and wetter, a body dropping against her front door like a sack of grain thrown from a moving wagon. And when she pulled it open into the gray pre-dawn light of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, what she found was not a stranger asking for directions or a drunk sleeping off a long night at Harlan's saloon. What she found was a man collapsed against her doorframe with a bullet wound bleeding through his shirt, a wanted poster clutched in his fist, and her own name written on the back of it in handwriting she did not recognize. Etta Leland, the note said. He is coming for you next. She did not scream. She had stopped being a woman who screamed the year her husband died, and that was 3 years gone now. Instead, she looked at the man, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, jaw rough with several days of unshaved growth, and she made a calculation the way women on the frontier learned to make calculations quickly. He was breathing. He was armed, but his holster was empty, the revolver gone, which meant someone had taken it or he had used every last bullet before falling here. He was carrying a message meant to protect her, and that meant, at least for this moment, he was not her enemy. She grabbed him under the arms and dragged him inside. What she did not know yet, what she could not have known standing in her doorway with the Kansas wind cold against her back and the sun still below the horizon, was that the man she dragged inside was James Sheridan, and that his name had appeared on wanted posters from Texas to Colorado for the better part of 4 years. She did not know that his dark past ran so deep it had swallowed men whole, that he had ridden with a gang that left a trail of broken banks and broken families across 3 territories, and that the very people hunting him were the same people now hunting her. She did not know any of that yet. All she knew was that he was bleeding on her kitchen floor, and that she was the only thing standing between him and the dawn. She would learn everything else soon enough. But first, the beginning. Etta Leland had come to Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1879, with her husband, Robert, who had the broad optimism of a man who believed the frontier owed him something. He had purchased 40 acres on the edge of town with money borrowed from his father back in Missouri, and he had promised Etta a house, a garden, and a future that stretched all the way to the horizon. Robert was not a bad man. He was simply not built for the land he had chosen. 2 winters broke him, the second one broke his lungs, and by the spring of 1880 Etta was a widow at 26 years old with a half-finished house, 40 acres of dirt, and nothing between her and the open sky but her own stubbornness. She stayed anyway. People in Caldwell wondered about that, quietly. A widow with no children and no family within 400 miles could have gone back east. She could have gone to Kansas City or returned to Missouri, could have found a life that was softer, warmer, more suited to a woman alone. But Etta had looked at those 40 acres after Robert's burial and decided that no one was going to take from her what she and her husband had bled for. She finished the house herself, with help from old Clarence Webb, who ran the hardware store and felt guilty enough about her situation to donate his Saturdays. She broke the soil herself, planted herself, learned from failure and tried again. By 1882, her farmstead was modest but real. She had a kitchen garden, a small flock of chickens, 2 horses, a milk cow named Florence, and a reputation in Caldwell as a woman you did not push around. That reputation was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. The trouble had started 6 weeks before the morning James Sheridan fell against her door. It started with a man named Clarence Dole, which was an unfortunately ordinary name for a man who was spectacularly dangerous. Dole had arrived in Caldwell with a group of riders who dressed too well for honest work and asked too many questions about the layout of the surrounding land. He had approached Etta twice at the general store, once to ask about purchasing her acreage, which she had refused, and once to tell her, in a voice so mild it was nearly polite, that she would be making a mistake if she continued to refuse. She had told him, in a voice equally mild, that he could take his opinion and his riders and ride them all the way back to wherever they had come from. He had smiled at her. It was the kind of smile that lived on a man's face and never reached his eyes, and it had stayed with her in the way that only genuinely dangerous things stay with you, not on the surface of the mind but underneath it, in the dark place where the body keeps its warnings. She had written to the sheriff, a man named Aldous Pierce, who was decent enough but stretched thin across a county that had too much land and not enough law. Pierce had come out to speak with Dole and his men, and afterward had ridden back to Etta's farm looking like a man who had been shown something he wished he hadn't seen. He told her to be careful. He told her to keep her rifle loaded. He told her he would do what he could, and she understood that to mean, not enough. So when a bleeding stranger arrived on her porch carrying a note with her name on it, and the words "He is coming for you next," Etta was already a woman primed for battle. She was afraid, yes. She was not foolish enough to deny fear, but she was also angry, and the anger was larger than the fear. And that was what kept her hand steady as she cut the man's shirt away from the wound in his left shoulder, and packed it with clean cloth, and pressed hard the way she had learned when Robert's friend had been gored by a steer 3 years ago. The man, James Sheridan, though she did not know his name, yet regained consciousness in stages. First came sound, low and struggling, and then his hand came up and caught her wrist with a grip that was still strong despite everything, and she said, firmly and without flinching, "I am not going to hurt you. I'm trying to stop the bleeding. If you fight me, I will tie your hands and do it anyway, so your choice." He stared at her. His eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, a gray-brown that shifted depending on the light, and in that moment they were wide and confused and searching her face for threat. Whatever he found there, or didn't find, made him release her wrist and let his arm fall back. "Good decision," Etta said. She worked in silence for several minutes. The wound was through the flesh of the shoulder, missing bone, which was lucky. He had lost significant blood, but the bleeding was slowing and the entry and exit were clean, which meant no fragment to dig out. She flushed it with whiskey from the bottle she kept for medicinal purposes. Robert had always believed a farm without whiskey was a farm poorly managed, and she felt the man tighten his jaw against the pain and not make a sound, and she noted that as well. "Who are you?" she asked, tying the final bandage. A pause long enough to count. "James," he said finally. His voice was low, rough-edged from pain, but not unkind. "James Sheridan." Etta sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time. Somewhere around 30, she guessed, though the frontier had a way of adding years to a face. Strong jaw, strong nose, dark brows pulled together by either pain or worry. The hands were calloused and scarred in ways that spoke of hard use. He wore good boots, which told her something, and a coat that had once been expensive and was now battered enough to tell a story of its own. "James Sheridan," she repeated. "And what brings James Sheridan bleeding to my porch at 4 in the morning? I need to know," he said slowly, meeting her eyes, "if you have any idea what Clarence Dole wants with your land." The name hit her like cold water. "I know what he says he wants. He says he wants to buy it. He doesn't want to buy it." James Sheridan pushed himself up to sitting, and she could see the effort that cost him, see the white edge of pain around his mouth. "He wants what's under it. There's a route, an old cattle drive corridor that cuts directly through your property, and Dole needs it to run stolen horses north to sell them at double price to army buyers who ask no questions. Your 40 acres are the linchpin. Without your land in the middle, the route doesn't work. The properties on either side of you already sold to his people. You're the last holdout." Etta was quiet for a moment, processing this. "How do you know this?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I used to ride with him." There it was, the truth hanging in the air of her kitchen like smoke from a banked fire, not quite burning but impossible to breathe around. She looked at this man who had dragged himself to her door and told her his dark past in the second sentence of their acquaintance, and she thought about what that meant. It meant he had chosen to tell her, which cost something. It meant he was not pretending to be something he wasn't, not constructing a lie elaborate enough to earn her trust, which a smarter and more dishonest man might have done. "And now," she said, "now I left. he said. 18 months ago. There were things I won't describe to you in your own kitchen, things that made it clear to me that I could not continue. I rode out and I kept riding. I have been trying to bury that past ever since, Miss Leland, she said. Etta Leland. Miss Leland. He said her name carefully, as though testing the weight of it. I found out Dole was moving on Caldwell because I still have a contact who sends me word when Dole's operations move towards something I can't stomach. When I heard about you, that you'd been refusing him, that you were alone out here, I rode 3 days to get here. You rode 3 days to warn a woman you've never met. I rode 3 days, he said, because the last time I ignored my conscience people got hurt who should not have gotten hurt. I am not interested in making that mistake again. Etta stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the eastern edge, the darkness pulling back in thin strips of gray and rose. She could see her garden, her fence line, the 2 horses moving in the small paddock, everything she had built alone, everything Dole wanted to take. She turned back to James Sheridan. "There is a bed in the back room," she said. "You will sleep in it and you will not die from that wound, because I did not spend an hour patching you up to have you die in my kitchen. We will talk more when you are rested." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, something between gratitude and surprise, as though he had come expecting to deliver his message and be sent away, had not anticipated being offered rest or care or the simple human courtesy of a bed. "Miss Leland," he said carefully, "you should know that there is a warrant for my arrest in the territory of Texas, and possibly in—" "I know what a wanted poster looks like," she said, "since you were holding one when you arrived. We can discuss the implications of that after you have slept. Can you stand?" He could barely, and she helped him to the back room with less sentimentality than a field surgeon and more care than she let show on her face. She left him with water and a blanket, and the morning light coming in soft through the east-facing window, and she went back to her kitchen and sat down at the table and pressed her palms flat against the wood and breathed. Then she reloaded her rifle and set it by the door, because she was a practical woman, and because being moved by someone's honesty and being reckless were not the same thing. James Sheridan slept through the morning and into the afternoon, which she took as a good sign. Etta did her chores, fed the chickens, checked on Florence the cow, worked in the garden until her hands were dirty, and her thoughts were organized into something she could manage. She thought about Clarence Dole, about what James had told her regarding the land corridor, about the fact that the 2 properties flanking hers had changed hands in the last 8 months. She had noticed that, had not understood it, and now understood it with a cold clarity that settled in her stomach like a stone. She thought about James Sheridan. She thought about his eyes and his voice and the way he had said her name. She thought about the wanted poster and what it represented, the dark past he had named openly, the crimes implied in those 4 years of riding with a man like Dole. She thought about the note, "He is coming for you next," and felt the threat of it differently than she had at dawn, felt it now as something specific and approaching rather than abstract and distant. She thought about the fact that she had let a wanted man into her home and was not, if she was being rigorously honest with herself, regretting it. When James woke in the late afternoon, she brought him broth and cornbread, which he ate slowly and with visible effort and genuine gratitude. His color was better. The wound, she checked, was not showing signs of fever or infection. He would need to rest several more days before he was fit to do much, which created a logistical situation she had not fully thought through when she had made the impulse decision to drag him inside. "We need to talk about your plan," she said, setting the empty bowl aside and sitting in the chair by the window. "I don't have much of one beyond getting you the information," he admitted. "I thought if you knew, if Sheriff Pierce knew what Dole's actual operation was, the horse theft angle, the Army connection, maybe that would be enough to bring federal attention down on him. The marshal's office out of Wichita has jurisdiction for something this size. Pierce already knows something's wrong," Etta said. "He's been watching Dole's men, but he has no evidence, nothing specific. Dole is careful. He is, but he has a weakness. James shifted against the pillow, and she saw him work through the pain of movement with that same lockjaw discipline she had noticed when she was packing his wound. There's a man named Gideon Prout who handles the bookkeeping for the horse operation, where the animals come from, where they're sold, who the buyers are in the army. Prout is not a true believer in Dole's operation. He's a man who was made to feel he had no other choice. If someone offered him genuine protection, a way out, a deal with the marshals in exchange for testimony, he would take it. Where is this Prout? Colby Township, 2 hours west of here. He runs a feed store as cover. James looked at her carefully. This is not something you should have to involve yourself in, Miss Leland. I am telling you because you deserve to know all of it, but the risk of approaching Prout, of contacting the marshals, James, she said, and his name arrived in her mouth naturally, without the formality of his surname, and she saw something shift very slightly in his expression. I have been on this land for 3 years fighting for it. This is not new involvement. This is continuation. He was quiet for a moment. You are not what I expected, he said finally. What did you expect? I don't know. Something more. He searched for the word breakable. I am not breakable, she said, not as a boast, but as a simple fact, the way you state the weather. No, he said, looking at her. I can see that. The next 3 days settled into a rhythm that she had not anticipated but found herself adapting to without resistance. She tended his wound morning and evening. He ate at her table and began, as his strength returned, to move around the house and eventually outside into the yard, where he fixed the fence rail that she had been meaning to address for 2 weeks and repaired the hinge on the chicken coop door without being asked. She watched him work from the kitchen window and felt something uncurl in her chest that she had kept very tightly coiled for a long time. They talked. They talked in the evenings when the day's work was done, and the light was going gold and then amber through the windows, and she built a fire not because the spring nights were cold enough to require it, but because the fire made the conversation feel easier, less exposed. He told her things carefully, never volunteering more than she asked, as though he were acutely aware of the cost that information carried and wanted to let her set the price. She asked him about how he had come to ride with Dole, and he told her without excuse or embellishment. He had been 22 and broke, and coming off the worst winter of his life in the Texas Panhandle, a winter that had taken the cattle operation where he'd worked and left him with nothing. Dole had found him in that broke and directionless state and had offered what looked, from the bottom of desperation, like an opportunity. He had told himself it was temporary. He had told himself the same thing for 4 years. What changed it? Etta asked. You said there were things that made you understand you couldn't continue. What things? He looked at the fire for a long time. There was a farmstead near Abilene, he said. A family, a couple, young children. They were on land that Dole wanted, a different corridor, a different scheme. I was there when Dole sent men to deliver the message. I was supposed to be there to make the message more convincing. He stopped. I did not hurt them. I want you to be clear on that. But I stood by while others were threatening people who had done nothing wrong, and I told myself that standing by was not the same as participating, and I want you to know that I understand now that it was exactly the same thing. Etta was quiet. The fire moved. I left the next morning, he said. I did not tell Dole or anyone else. I took my horse and I rode north, and I have not stopped moving since, picking up honest work where I could find it, trying to build a life that was not built on someone else's suffering. He turned from the fire to look at her. I know that does not undo the years. I know that saying I changed is not evidence that I changed. I am not asking you to believe me on the basis of my own word. What are you asking? She said. I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe nothing. Maybe just to be useful while I'm here, to help you deal with Dole and then move on. And move on. She heard those 2 words and felt them land with more weight than she had expected. You don't have to move on immediately, she said carefully. He looked at her. There was something very careful and very exposed in his expression, the look of a man who had taught himself not to want things and was suddenly confronted with the possibility that wanting might be permissible. "Miss Leland, Etta," she said. "My name is Etta." "Etta," he said, and the word was quiet and deliberate, and she felt it in her sternum like a struck bell. On the fourth day, Etta rode to Caldwell to speak with Sheriff Pierce. She did not tell Pierce about James. She thought carefully about that, and decided that revealing the presence of a wanted man on her property was a complication she could not afford until the larger threat was addressed. Instead, she told Pierce about the land corridor, about the horse theft operation and the army buyers, information precise enough and specific enough that Pierce's eyes changed, shifted from the careful, polite doubt he had been showing her for weeks into something sharper and more engaged. "Where did you come by this?" he asked. "A reliable source," she said, "and there is a man in Colby Township named Gideon Prout who runs a feed store and keeps the books for the operation. If the marshals offered him protection in exchange for testimony, he would take it." Pierce looked at her for a long moment. "Etta, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Is there anyone at your farm right now who shouldn't be there?" She met his eyes without flinching. "There is no one at my farm who means me harm," she said, which was true. Pierce let it rest, but she could see him filing the distinction away. He was not a stupid man. "I'll wire the marshal's office in Wichita," he said. "If this pans out the way you're describing, we're looking at federal-level involvement, and that changes things considerably for Dole." "How long?" she asked. "A week, maybe 10 days to get someone out here." She nodded. "Then I need to not give Dole any reason to move faster than he already is." She rode back to the farm with the afternoon sun on her back and found James in the yard, doing something careful and methodical with her second horse, the bay mare named Copper, who had been skittish with strangers since Robert died. The mare's head was down, and James was standing very still beside her, not pushing, not forcing, just present, and Etta watched from the gate as Copper very slowly pressed her nose against his arm. She felt something shift in her chest again, larger this time, less controllable. "She's been difficult for 3 years, Etta said, coming through the gate. "I don't know what you did." "Nothing," James said, still quiet, not startling the mare. "I just waited." They looked at each other across Copper's back, and the afternoon light was doing something unreasonable to the plains, turning everything to gold and copper and distant purple, and Etta thought with sudden, uncomplicated clarity, "This man has been running from who he was, and I have been standing still holding what I built, and we have arrived at the same place from entirely different directions, and there might be something in that." She looked away before she said any of it. The 5th evening, he asked her about Robert. She told him honestly, the optimism, the borrowed money, the 2 hard winters, the death that had been both a shock and, if she was truthful, not a total surprise given how thin Robert had become, how his cough had deepened through that second winter. She told James about the burial, the decision to stay, the years of building alone. "Do you regret it?" James asked. "Staying?" "Never," she said. "Not for one day. Not even now with Dole's threat." She shook her head. "Especially not now. Because now I understand what I'm defending. When it was just abstract, just the idea of keeping what I'd built, it was less clear. Now that someone is trying to take it, now that I know why and how specifically they mean to do it, I understand what this land is. It's mine. It's the only thing I have made entirely by and for myself, and I will not hand it to a man like Clarence Dole." James looked at her with an expression that she was beginning to learn to read, a particular mixture of admiration and something more private, something he kept behind the admiration the way you keep the real treasure behind the display case. "Tell me something," she said. "When you left Texas, when you rode north, did you have any place in mind, any specific destination?" "No," he said, "just away." "Just away," he agreed. "And then looking for something, though I wouldn't have named it that at the time. I told myself I was looking for honest work, something that would let me feel like I was building rather than taking." He paused. "I found pieces of it. A season helping with a cattle drive up from Dodge City, running cattle honestly for an honest man, and I felt something like what I imagine you feel when you look at this farm. Something that was mine in the making of it, even if nothing about it was permanent." "It doesn't have to not be permanent," Etta said, and she heard the words leaving her mouth with more implication than she had intended, and she watched James hear that implication, watched it move through his expression like wind through tall grass, there and gone and leaving a change in the air. "Etta," he said slowly, "I'm a wanted man. You are a man who made bad choices under desperate circumstances and then chose differently," she said. "Those are not the same thing. The warrants don't distinguish." "Then we deal with the warrants." She said it the way she said everything, as though difficulty were simply a problem with a solution rather than a reason to stop trying. "If Prout testifies, if the marshals dismantle Dole's operation, there will be federal officers in Caldwell. That is an opportunity. Your information about the operation, what you know, what you could testify to, could be leveraged. Cooperation with a federal investigation. It has happened before." He was staring at her. "You have thought about this?" "I have thought about very little else for the past 2 days," she said honestly, and felt the heat of admission rise in her face, which annoyed her because she was not generally given to blushing. "Your situation is solvable, James. I do not say that as a reassurance. I say it because I have turned it over from every angle and I believe it to be factually true." He was very quiet. The fire was low and the room was warm and the night outside was full of spring sounds, the insects starting up, the wind through the new grass. He was looking at her with that expression, the one behind the admiration fully visible now, no longer behind anything, and she looked back at him and did not look away. "Why?" he said softly. "Why are you doing any of this?" "I arrived on your doorstep bleeding and in possession of a criminal record, and you have. You have given me more grace than I have given myself in 4 years. Because," she said, choosing her words carefully, "I'm a woman who knows the difference between what a person has done and what a person is. And what you are, James Sheridan, is someone who has been trying, imperfectly and often unsuccessfully, to be worthy of better than your worst choices. I recognize that. I respect it." She paused. "And I find that I very much do not want you to ride away from here when this is over." The silence after that was the kind of silence that has weight and texture. James said, "I find that I very much do not want to ride away from here either." He did not cross the room to her. He was too careful for that, too aware of the threshold they had just arrived at and the importance of not rushing past it. But his hand, resting on the arm of his chair, turned palm up, and she looked at it, and she reached across the space between them and placed her hand in his, and that was enough for now, and it was more than either of them had expected, and the fire burned low and warm around them. The following day brought the first real test. Etta was in the garden when she heard riders on the road, and the sound of them, more than 2, moving with purpose, made her straighten and shade her eyes and look. 3 men coming down the track toward her farm, Dole's men by their dress and the way they rode, that particular arrogance of men who believe themselves untouchable. She walked to the house at a measured pace and came back with her rifle by the time they reached her gate. James appeared from the barn. She had not asked him to. He had heard the riders and come without being asked, and he stood slightly back from her and to her left, which was the right position tactically, and also communicated something to Dole's men, that she was not alone. The lead rider was a man she recognized from her previous encounters with Dole's group, a heavy-set man with a red beard named Warren, who did the talking when Dole chose not to come himself. "Mrs. Leland," Warren said from horseback, looking past her at James with an expression that moved from surprise to calculation to something harder. "Mr. Dole would like to make another offer on your property. He has authorized me to offer you $1,500, which is above market value, I know," Etta said. "The answer is no, as it was the last 2 times." Warren's eyes did not move from James. "I see you have company." "I have a hired hand," Etta said evenly. "A new one. My previous arrangement fell through." Warren studied James with the particular attention of a man who is searching his memory for something. Etta kept her grip on the rifle easy and visible. She could feel James behind her left shoulder, still and watchful. "Mr. Dole is going to want to speak with you personally," Warren said finally. "He is a patient man, Mrs. Leland, but there are limits to patience." "Tell Mr. Dole," Etta said, "that my limits have already been reached." "My answer is no. It will remain no. And if his patience extends to legal harassment, I have already made the relevant parties aware of the situation." Warren's expression shifted at that, a very small tightening that she might have missed if she had not been watching for it. "Have a good day, Mrs. Leland," he said, and turned his horse. She watched them ride away until they were small in the distance and then smaller and then gone. She lowered the rifle. Her hands were steady. "He recognized you," she said to James. "Yes," James said. "He's not sure. The beard changes my face somewhat, and it's been 18 months, but he has the outline of it. He'll tell Dole." "How much time does that give us?" "A day, perhaps 2. Dole will want to be certain before he moves." But once he is certain, James turned to face her, and his expression was direct and unhedged. "He will know why I'm here. He'll know what I know. He'll move faster than he planned." "Then we move faster than he plans," Etta said. She went inside and wrote 2 letters that afternoon. The first was to Sheriff Pierce, telling him plainly that the situation had accelerated and requesting he expedite his contact with the marshal's office in Wichita. The second she addressed to Gideon Pruitt at his feed store in Colby Township. A careful, specific letter that told Pruitt she knew who he was and what he kept in his ledgers, and that there were people prepared to offer him genuine protection and a negotiated arrangement with federal law in exchange for his cooperation, and that he had, by her estimate, a very short window in which this offer would remain available. James read both letters before she sealed them, which she offered deliberately, and he made 2 small suggestions about phrasing in the second letter, based on his knowledge of Pruitt's specific anxieties, which she incorporated. They worked at her kitchen table with the lamp burning between them and the evening coming down outside, and there was something in the collaborative intimacy of it, the shared purpose, that felt like something she had not felt since before Robert died, something she had not expected to feel again. She sent both letters with Clarence Webb's 14-year-old nephew the next morning, the boy making the rounds on a route he had ridden so many times no one would remark on it. Then she and James did the only thing they could do, which was wait and work the farm and let the days move. The waiting was not idle. James, his shoulder healing steadily, took on the full weight of the farm's physical demands without discussion or display, simply doing what needed doing with the focused efficiency of a man who was comfortable with physical work and grateful for the direction it gave his body when his mind was occupied with larger concerns. He repaired the roof of the barn where it had been leaking since November. He turned the south field, which she had been meaning to plant with corn, working the soil with a steadiness that she watched from the kitchen window more often than was strictly necessary. And they talked. They talked every evening, and the conversations went deeper each time. The way water finds its level personal, specific, honest in ways that surprised both of them. He told her about growing up in East Texas on his family's small farm, the parents who had worked themselves to hollow and still lost the land in a drought year, the older brother who had gone to work on the railroads and been killed in an accident before James was 20. The accumulation of losses that had made a desperate 22-year-old boy vulnerable to the wrong kind of offer. She told him things she had not told anyone, not Pierce, not Clarence Webb, not the women of Caldwell who had been kind to her in the efficient, slightly distant way of frontier communities. She told him that the loneliness of the past 3 years had been a physical thing, a weight in her chest that she had simply grown accustomed to carrying. She told him that she had believed herself finished with wanting, finished with the particular wanting that goes outward toward another person, and that she was startled to discover she had been wrong. He listened to her the way she suspected no one had listened to her in a long time. not waiting for his turn to speak, not formulating a response while she was still talking, but actually receiving what she said, which was rarer than it should be and which she valued more than she could easily articulate. On the 8th day, 2 things happened. The first was a letter returned from Sheriff Pierce, terse and urgent, telling her that he had been in contact with Deputy U.S. Marshal Carl Hatcher out of Wichita, and that Hatcher was already en route to Caldwell, ahead of schedule, because, and Pierce's wording here was careful, certain information had corroborated the scope of Dole's operation beyond what even Pierce had expected. Hatcher would arrive within 2 days. The second thing that happened was Clarence Dole himself. He came alone, which was either a show of confidence or a trap, and she was not immediately certain which. He arrived in late afternoon, riding a big sorrel horse, dressed in the expensive dark coat he always wore, his face carrying that mild, perpetual almost smile. He came up the track slowly and dismounted at the gate with the unhurried ease of a man paying a social call. Etta was on the porch. She had the rifle. James was in the barn. She felt rather than saw the moment he registered the rider, felt the stillness settle over the barn the way a held breath settles over a room. Mrs. Leland, Dole said, coming to the foot of the porch steps. He did not come up them, which was either courtesy or caution. I have been hoping to speak with you personally. You are speaking with me personally now, she said. My answer to your proposal is still no. Dole looked at her for a moment, then past her at the door of the house, then toward the barn. I understand you've taken on a new hired hand, he said. I have. A man by the name of Sheridan, I believe. Etta did not let the name move her face. I hired a man to help with the farm work. What I call him is my business. Dole's almost smile did not flicker. Mrs. Leland, I want to have an honest conversation with you. James Sheridan is a wanted man in the state of Texas. I am aware that you may not have known that when you hired him, and I am willing to believe you acted in good faith. However, harboring a fugitive is itself a serious legal matter, and I would hate for you to suffer consequences because of his deceptions. He paused. If you ask him to leave and reconsider my offer, I am prepared to be very generous and to forget that any of this transpired. Etta looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what James had told her, about the farmstead near Abilene, about standing by while threats were delivered to a family with children. She thought about the note, "He is coming for you next," that James had clutched in his bleeding hand. Mr. Dole, she said, I know about the land corridor. I know about the horse theft operation. I know about the army buyers. And I know about a man named Gideon Pruitt in Colby Township who keeps very detailed records. She let each piece land. I have been in contact with the federal marshal's office in Wichita. You have very little time before that conversation becomes your primary problem, and what you're offering me for my land is the least of your concerns. The almost smile was gone. For just a moment, a second at most, she saw what lived underneath it, the cold and calculating thing that had made men afraid of Clarence Dole from Texas to Kansas. And then his face closed over it again, and what replaced the smile was something more dangerous than anger, which was calm decision. That, he said quietly, was a mistake, Mrs. Leland. Leave my property, she said. The rifle was not raised, but her hand was on it, and her posture communicated with perfect clarity that she would raise it with very little additional prompting. Dole held her gaze for 3 seconds, 4, 5. Then he turned and went back to his horse and mounted with that same unhurried ease and rode back up the track without looking at her again. James was at her side before the dust settled, moving from the barn with a speed that his healing shoulder visibly protested, coming up the porch steps and standing beside her, watching the retreating rider. He'll move tonight, James said, or early tomorrow morning at the latest. He cannot afford to wait now that you've told him what you know. Pierce's letter said the marshal is 2 days out. 2 days is too long. James turned to face her, and his expression was stripped of everything non-essential, just the direct and urgent truth. Etta, I need to ride to Colby Township tonight. If Pruitt received your letter and is willing to cooperate, I need to get him out of there before Dole reaches him. Dole will go for Prout first, eliminating the evidence, and then he'll come back here. I'll come with you, she said immediately. No, his voice was firm. Someone has to be here. If Dole sends men to the farm while we're both gone, he won't destroy what he wants to own, she said. He will destroy what threatens him, James said. Etta. He stepped closer to her, and his hand came up to her face with a care that was so precise and so deliberate that she felt it in her throat. His fingers were rough and warm against her cheek. Listen to me. I need you to ride to Pierce tonight, right now. Tell him Dole was here. Tell him 2 days is too long. Tell him he needs to get a wire to the marshal and move the timeline. Pierce can station a deputy here while you're in town. You'll be safer there. She looked up at him. And you? I'll be in Colby before midnight. He searched her face. I am coming back. I want you to know that. Whatever happens, I am not disappearing. She thought about the dark past he had been running from, about the warrants in Texas, about the man he was when he'd arrived on her porch bleeding and alone and carrying someone else's warning. She thought about who he was now in this moment on this porch, making her a promise with his hand against her face and his eyes steady on hers. She lifted her hand and put it over his. Come back in one piece, she said. That is the only condition I am placing on your freedom of movement. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, surprised out of him, warm. Yes, ma'am, he said. He kissed her then. Brief and honest, pressing his lips to her forehead with a tenderness that was so at odds with the urgency of everything around them that it caught her completely off guard, which was not easy to do, and she closed her eyes and let herself feel it, let herself be held in that second. And when he pulled back, she was looking at him with an expression that she suspected gave away a great deal. Ride to Pierce, he said softly. I'll be back by dawn. He took her faster horse, the gray named Arrow, and she saddled Copper and rode to town with the last of the daylight, reaching the sheriff's office as the lamps were being lit along Caldwell's main street. Pierce was still at his desk, which she was grateful for, and his face when she told him about Dole's visit showed a very satisfying shift from fatigue to alarm. He wired Wichita inside 15 minutes. The telegraph operator, a thin, nervous man named Doyle who had clearly overheard everything but had the professional discretion not to show it, sent the message at speed. Pierce dispatched his one deputy, a solid young man named Torres, to stand watch at Etta's farm, and then insisted she stay in town for the night, which she agreed to because James had asked her to and because she was not too proud to recognize when caution was the right choice. She did not sleep much. She lay in the spare room of the boarding house that Mrs. Kellerman ran and listened to the night sounds of Caldwell and thought about James riding west through the dark Kansas landscape, his shoulder not yet fully healed, going toward a man who might or might not cooperate in order to secure evidence against a man who had threatened both of their lives. She thought about the way he had kissed her forehead. She thought about the warmth of his hand against her face. She thought about 2 days ago at the kitchen table, his head bent over her letters, his dark hair falling slightly forward, the way he had looked up at her when he made his suggestion about Prout's specific anxieties, that quick, unguarded moment of shared intelligence, the smile that followed it. She was in love with him. She recognized it with the same flat clarity with which she recognized most important truths about herself. Not a dawning, not a gradual realization, but something that was simply present and undeniable when she looked directly at it, as though it had been there for some time, and she had only just turned to face it. He came back as he had promised, arriving at the farm just after dawn while Deputy Torres was still on the porch drinking the coffee he had made for himself. Etta was already riding back from town when she saw Arrow coming up the track from the opposite direction, and she put Copper into a canter and covered the distance between them faster than was probably dignified. Gideon Prout was with him. A thin, pale man in his 40s who looked as though he had not slept, which he probably had not, riding a borrowed horse and carrying a saddlebag that James told her later contained 3 years of meticulously kept ledgers documenting every transaction in Dole's horse theft operation, every name, every date, every payment to every army buyer. He was waiting, James said, drawing up beside her on the track. "He'd read your letter and he was packed and ready when I arrived. He's been wanting out for 2 years. He looked tired. He looked like he had ridden through the night and fought with himself the whole way and arrived at the right conclusion, which she thought might be an accurate description of how most of his recent decisions had been made. He also looked, when he saw her coming toward him, like a man who had not been certain he would see that specific sight again, and found that he was very glad to be wrong. "You're not dead," she said. "Was not planning on it," he said. Pruitt was settled in the house with coffee and the ledgers on the table and Tors watching the road, and James and Etta stood outside in the morning light, and she put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him carefully, checking, the way you check something that matters. "You need to sleep," she said. "Probably," he agreed, covering her hands with his. "And your shoulder," unimpressed with my recent activity but functioning. She laughed, and it surprised her because the morning was still tense, and the situation was not resolved. But the laugh came out anyway, genuine and unforced, and James looked at her when she laughed with an expression of such open warmth that she felt it like sunlight on skin after a long winter. Deputy U.S. Marshal Carl Hatcher arrived in Caldwell the following afternoon, a day ahead of his revised schedule, which said something about the urgency with which Wichita had received Pierce's wires. He was a composed, gray-eyed man in his 40s, methodical and precise in the way of someone who had seen enough chaos to develop a strong preference for order. He reviewed Pruitt's ledgers with the focused attention of a man reading a book he had been waiting for, and within 2 hours of his arrival, he had sent wires to 3 different offices and established a plan that moved Etta's head with its speed and scope. Dole was apprehended that evening, along with Warren and 4 other members of his operation, in a coordinated action that Hatcher executed with a brevity and decisiveness that impressed Pierce visibly. The men on either side of Etta's farm, whose properties Dole had purchased, proved, upon Hatcher's further inquiry, to have been purchased under coercion and fraud, and those transactions were ultimately voided by a territorial court over the following months. But on the evening of the apprehension, what concerned Etta most was not the legal architecture of what was being constructed around Clarence Dole. It was the conversation she needed to have with Hatcher about James. She had it that evening in Pierce's office, with Pierce present, and she laid out the case she had been building in her mind with the same methodical care she brought to everything. James Sheridan's history with Dole's operation, his voluntary departure 18 months prior, his 3 days' ride to Caldwell to warn her, the role he had played in securing Pruitt's cooperation, which had been the linchpin of the entire case against Dole, the information he possessed about the operation's Texas origins, information that extended beyond what Pruitt's ledgers covered and which would be valuable to federal prosecution. Hatcher listened. He was very good at listening. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're making an argument for cooperating witness status." "I am making an argument," Etta said, "for a man who chose the right thing when it was not the easy thing, and who is of considerably more use to justice as a cooperating witness than as a fugitive." Hatcher looked at Pierce. Pierce looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who is deciding how much he has actually seen this week. "I will need to speak with Mr. Sheridan directly," Hatcher said, "and the decision about any arrangement will rest with the prosecuting office in Texas, not with me." But he paused. The information he carries about Dole's Texas operations is precisely what the prosecuting office has been lacking. "I will recommend favorable consideration." It was not a promise, but it was the opening of a door, and Etta had learned that doors, once opened, could be walked through. She went back to the farm and told James, and watched his face move through something complicated, hope and disbelief, and the particular vulnerability of a man who has trained himself not to expect good things and is being offered one anyway. "Hatcher wants to speak with you tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "I know." He was sitting at her kitchen table, and he pressed his hands flat against the wood, which she recognized as a thing she herself did when she needed to feel the solidity of something real. "Etta," Whatever happens, whether this works or it doesn't, I want you to know that these past days have been—" He stopped. "You have given me something I did not think I was allowed to want anymore. A reason to try to be here, to stay somewhere." He met her eyes. "To stay." She crossed the kitchen and sat across from him and took both his hands in hers. "James Sheridan," she said, "you are the most self-deprecating man I have ever met, which is a significant achievement given the men I have known on the frontier. So let me be completely clear with you. I would like very much for you to stay, not as a hired hand and not temporarily. I am telling you what I want, which is not something I do lightly, and I expect you to receive it as it is intended, which is seriously." He looked at her for a long moment. "What exactly are you saying?" "I am saying that I would like us to find out what this is," she said, "properly, with a future attached to it." Something in his face settled, the way land settles after a long rain, all the tension finding its resolution. He brought her hands up and pressed them against his mouth and held them there for a moment, and when he lowered them his eyes were very bright. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what I want." The following months were the kind that rearrange the architecture of a life. James met with Hatcher 3 times over the course of the first month, providing detailed testimony about the Texas operations that extended Dole's criminal case across 2 additional states, and implicated several Army officers whose Byers-Pruitt's ledgers had only referenced obliquely. His testimony proved as valuable as Etta had argued it would be, and Hatcher was a man who honored his recommendations. The arrangement that came back from the prosecuting office in Austin was not a complete absolution. James was required to testify formally and to pay a fine that amounted to most of what he had saved in his 1.5 years of honest work. But it cleared the warrants, and it allowed him to stand in the sunlight in Caldwell, Kansas, without looking over his shoulder. He stood on Etta's porch the afternoon the official document arrived and read it through twice, and she stood beside him with her shoulder touching his and felt the very specific sensation of watching a person breathe fully for the first time. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then he pulled her into his arms and held her there in the spring afternoon light, and she felt his heartbeat and the strength of him and the realness of him, and she thought, "This is what it is to have your life change in a way you did not plan and would not trade." He kissed her properly that afternoon, standing on the porch of the farm she had built alone, and it was nothing like the careful forehead kiss of urgency and departure. It was slow and deliberate and mutual and real, and when it ended, she kept her hands against his chest, and he kept his arms around her, and they stood like that for a while in the warm Kansas air. And neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said that their presence in that moment was not already saying. Over the summer, James became something that both of them found they had no adequate word for in the conventional vocabulary of the frontier. Not a hired hand, not a boarder, not merely a suitor in the formal calling on Sundays sense that the town of Caldwell tried to apply to the situation. He was something more integrated than any of those categories, woven into the daily life of the farm and into Etta's daily life, with a naturalness that surprised people who had expected her to remain solitary and did not surprise her at all. He slept in the barn initially, which was the appropriate arrangement for propriety, and which Caldwell observed with varying degrees of satisfaction. Etta was aware of the talk. She was always aware of the talk, and she managed it with the same composure she brought to managing everything. But she was also clear in her own mind that the talk had very little bearing on what she knew to be true, which was that James Sheridan was a good man who had been given a second chance and was using it with everything he had. He proposed to her on a Tuesday in July, which she always thought later was exactly right, because a Tuesday was an ordinary working day with no ceremony attached to it, and the proposal came in the middle of an ordinary working day, while they were fixing the south fence line together in the summer heat. He said straightforwardly and without any theatrical preparation, "I would like to marry you, Etta, if you are willing. I think we should be married." She straightened from the fence post and looked at him, sweat damp and serious and entirely himself. "I think we should be married too," she said. They were married in October of 1882 in Caldwell's small church, in a ceremony that was attended by Sheriff Pierce and his wife, Clarence Webb and his nephew, Deputy Torres and his mother, who had driven out from Wichita for the occasion because Torres had talked about nothing else for months, Mrs. Kellerman from the boarding house, and a considerable portion of Caldwell's population who had decided that, however unconventional the situation had been, it had ended in a proper marriage and therefore was something to celebrate. Gideon Prout attended as well. He had, under the protection of Hatcher's arrangement, relocated from Colby Township to Caldwell and was operating a legitimate feed and grain business that was doing well enough to make him, within a year, one of the more established commercial figures in the town. He stood at the back of the church with an expression that combined relief and genuine happiness in a way that was particular to people who have recently been able to stop being afraid. James wore a new coat, dark wool, well-fitted. Etta wore her best dress, blue cotton the color of late summer sky, and she carried no flowers because she was not a flowers-carrying sort of person, but she had pinned her hair up and left 2 dark strands down against her cheek. And when James saw her come down the church aisle, he looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded and so full that Pierce's wife had to press her handkerchief against her mouth. The ceremony was short and the party afterward was long, as is right and proper. Caldwell celebrated with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a town that had recently been relieved of a significant threat and was in the mood for joy. There was music from a fiddle player named Garrett who played until his arm gave out. There was food that the women of the town had organized with competitive thoroughness. There was whiskey, drunk moderately by most and less moderately by some. James danced with Etta twice, which was once more than he had expected to be capable of given that he had never considered himself a dancing man. She taught him the second time, leading from what looked like following, which he thought afterward was probably how she handled most things and which he found he admired completely. "Happy," he said, very quietly, when the music was between songs and they were standing close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. "Extraordinarily," she said, equally quiet, looking up at him. The farm in the winter of that first married year was different from every winter before it, and Etta noticed the difference not in any one dramatic way, but in the accumulation of small things that add up to the texture of a life. The sounds in the morning, his sounds, the particular way he moved around the kitchen, the way he talked to the horses, the weight of presence where there had been absence, the conversations that picked up in the evening where they had left off in the morning, unbroken, continuous, the kind of conversation that only exists between people who have decided to share the full length of their days. He was good with the land. Better than good, with the specific competence of someone raised on farming who had been forced away from it, and was now returning with both native skill and years of additional experience. He had ideas about the South field that proved, come spring, to produce the best corn yield Etta had had in 3 years. He built a proper storage shed in November that transformed how she managed the root vegetables over winter. Small things and significant things, all adding to the same conclusion. This was a man who intended to be here, who was building as though the future were a real place he planned to inhabit. She was pregnant by the following spring. She told him on a morning in March, simply and directly, as she told him most things. He went very still for a moment, the way he did when something hit the deeper register, below the ordinary processing of information. Then he set down the coffee cup he was holding and came around the table and took her face in his hands with that careful precision she knew by heart now and looked at her. "Are you well?" he said first, which told her everything she needed to know about the man she had married. "I am well," she said. "I am more than well." He kissed her, and the kitchen was bright with March morning light. And outside Florence the cow could be heard expressing her opinions about the spring thaw, and Etta laughed against his mouth and felt, with full and unambiguous certainty, that this was the right place, the right time, and the right person. Their son was born in September of 1883, in the back bedroom with the east-facing window where James had first slept and recovered from his shoulder wound, which Etta noted privately and found satisfying as a kind of circularity. The birth was managed by the town's doctor and by Mrs. Kellerman, who had delivered more children than she could count and whose calm efficiency in a crisis was exactly what was needed. James spent the labor hours in the yard doing tasks that did not need doing, because he could not be still and he could not be useful inside, and the only other option was panic, which he refused on principle. When Mrs. Kellerman came to the door and told him he had a son, he went very still in the middle of hammering a fence post that was already solid, and then he put the hammer down and pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and breathed. He was allowed in a few minutes later, and he sat beside Etta and looked at the baby, small and outraged and entirely real, with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something new, something that had not existed in his vocabulary until this moment. He was quiet for a long time. "He is very small," James said finally. "He will not remain so," Etta said. "No." He looked up at her and she saw that his eyes were wet, which he was not hiding, which meant he was past the point of managing his composure and had decided not to try. "How are you?" "Tired," she said honestly, "and very glad." She reached out and took his hand. "What shall we call him?" They had talked about names but not settled. James looked at the baby again, at the small, fierce face. "Robert," he said, "if you're willing, for your husband." She looked at him. She had not expected that, had not expected him to offer the name of the man who had come before him, the man whose death had left her the farm, the life, the stubbornness that had been standing on that porch with a rifle when James Sheridan arrived bleeding. "Robert," she said softly. "Yes, I think that's exactly right. Robert James Sheridan, born September 1883. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's particular expression of focused determination, visible within weeks in the way he faced the world head-on. And he grew through his first year with the healthy vigor of someone who has decided to be fully present in the life he has been given. Caldwell itself had changed over those 2 years in ways both visible and invisible. The void left by Dole's operation and the clearing of the land corruption around it had allowed several honest settlers to come to the properties that had changed hands under duress, restored now to their proper status. The town was growing slowly, in the frontier manner, but with the genuine growth of a community rather than the imposed expansion of a criminal operation. Pierce stood for election as county sheriff and won handily. Torres was promoted to deputy sheriff, which pleased his mother considerably. Gideon Pruitt's feed and grain store became the place where people brought their problems, because Pruitt turned out to be a man of unexpected warmth and practicality, someone whose years of coerced complicity had given him a very clear sense of what it felt like to have no options, and who therefore went out of his way to create options for people who needed them. He and James developed a friendship based on the particular bond of men who have both been the worst version of themselves and clawed their way back, the kind of friendship that does not need much language because the understanding underneath it is complete. In the summer of 1885, Etta Sheridan, sitting on the porch of her farm with her 2-year-old son playing in the yard and her husband building out the new room they were adding to the east side of the house, thought about what her life had been 3 years ago. The loneliness, the threat, the rifle always by the door. The morning she had opened that door and found a bleeding man with her name on a note in his fist. She thought about the decision she had made in that moment, the calculation that had not been entirely rational, the thing that had led her to drag him inside rather than send for help and wait at a distance. She thought about what she had seen in him, not the wanted poster, not the admitted dark past, but the fact of the note itself, the fact that he had ridden 3 days to deliver it, the fact that whatever he had been, he had chosen to be something else. She had always trusted her own judgment, even when she stayed on this land alone when everyone expected her to leave, even when she refused Dole's offers when it would have been much easier to take the money and go, even when she let a stranger with a criminal record sleep in her back room. Her judgment had been, overall, reliable, and she had learned to trust it the way you learn to trust a good horse, not blindly, not without attention, but with the confidence of accumulated experience. James looked up from where he was working on the new room's frame and found her watching him. He raised his eyebrows, which was their shorthand for a question. She shook her head slightly, which was her shorthand for nothing, just looking. He smiled, the particular smile that was only hers, not the public one he used for the town, not the polite one for strangers, but the one that lived in the corners of his mouth and reached all the way back to his gray-brown eyes and went back to work. She was pregnant again, 3 months along, which she had not told him yet but planned to tell him tonight over supper, watching his face do that thing it did, the deep processing, the going still, the eyes going bright. She looked forward to it with the pleasure of someone who has learned to look forward to things again, to trust that good things are not taken back the moment you acknowledge them. Robert toddled over to the porch steps and looked up at her with James's eyes and her own expression. "Mama," he said, with the authority of a 2-year-old who has discovered language and intends to use it thoroughly. "Bird." "Yes," she said. "A bird. Where?" He pointed with great confidence in a direction that contained no visible bird, but she looked anyway, because he was so certain, and because looking at the world with that kind of certainty was something she wanted to encourage. That evening, after supper, after Robert was put to bed in the small bedroom that had been built specifically for him, when it became clear that having a child share the main bedroom was an arrangement that served no one, Etta and James sat on the porch in the late August warmth. The sky was enormous above the Kansas plain, the stars starting to appear in the deep blue, the fireflies beginning their lazy punctuations of light in the tall grass near the fence. "I have something to tell you," she said. He turned to look at her. His arm was along the back of the porch bench, his shoulder warm against hers. She could feel him reading her expression with the ease of a man who has spent 3 years learning someone's face. "You're expecting," he said softly. She laughed. "How did you know?" "The way you looked at me over supper," he said, "like you were deciding when to tell me something." "I was deciding over supper," she said. "I decided just now." He pulled her close with his arm around her shoulders, and she settled against him, and they looked out at the enormous Kansas sky together. "When?" he said. "February, I think." "In this weather, February will be welcome," he said. There was something in his voice, warmth, happiness, the particular depth that meant it had gone past ordinary feeling into the real foundation of things. A brother or sister for Robert. Yes. He pressed his lips against the top of her head and held them there. She closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds of the farm, the horses moving in the paddock, the occasional commentary from Florence, the wind in the grass, the fireflies making no sound at all but somehow making a presence, and under all of it the steady heartbeat of a man she had chosen and who had chosen her back, and the land she had refused to give up, and the life she had built one decision at a time. The note had said, "He is coming for you next." He had come, and she had opened the door. And the person who had been coming for her, the real one, the one worth opening the door for, had turned out to be the bleeding man in the doorway rather than the threat he'd been warning her against. She had always trusted her judgment. The baby born in February of 1886 was a girl, healthy and loud, with Etta's dark eyes and an opinion about every aspect of her arrival that she expressed at volume. They named her Clara Ruth, and Robert, who was 2.5 and had opinions of his own, greeted her with the suspicious interest of a child, who is not yet sure whether this new development is an improvement, but is willing to monitor the situation. James held Clara Ruth the morning after her birth with the same stillness he had brought to holding Robert, and looked at her with that same new vocabulary of expression. And Etta, watching from the bed, thought, We have made a family. We have, out of wreckage and choice and stubbornness and a bleeding stranger on a porch, made a family. The years that followed were not easy in every respect. The frontier was never easy, and there were hard winters and failed crops and the ordinary sorrows of life lived close to the elements. There was a summer where the drought was severe enough to threaten the corn and James, and Etta worked 18-hour days hauling water and making decisions about which plants could be saved. And there were weeks of that summer when the exhaustion and the worry made conversation almost impossible, and they communicated in gestures and glances, and the simple presence of a hand on an arm. But there were also the years of good harvest, the neighbors who became friends, the sound of children in the house that had once been so quiet. There was the evening in 1888 when James received a letter from his contact in the South telling him that Clarence Dole had been convicted in federal court on the expanded charges James's testimony had helped establish, and sentenced to 15 years in the federal penitentiary in Kansas. And James had read the letter twice and then put it down on the table and said nothing for a moment and then said, very quietly, "It's over, all of it." "Yes," Etta said, "all of it." He looked at her across the supper table with Robert and Clara Ruth on either side of them, the lamp warm and the kitchen smelling of the meal they had just finished, and what was in his expression was so complete and so settled that she felt it in her chest like the end of a long-held breath. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, "not to the room, not to the news, but to her, for what you decided that morning, when you could have sent for help and kept your distance and made a very different choice." "You were bleeding on my porch," she said. "What was I supposed to do? A great many people," he said, "would have made a different decision. I am not a great many people." "No," he said with that smile, the real one. "You are entirely yourself, and I am deeply grateful for it." Robert, who was 5 and deeply interested in adult conversations that he only partially understood, said, "What is grateful?" "It means," James said, "that you have something you could not have imagined having, and you know you did not earn it alone, and you want to honor that." Robert considered this with the thoroughness of a 5-year-old who takes words seriously. "Like my horse," he said finally, referring to the small spotted pony that James had acquired for him at the beginning of spring. "Exactly like your horse," James said. Etta laughed and James laughed, and Clara Ruth, who was 2 and not entirely sure what the laughing was about but knew she wanted to be part of it, added her own enthusiastic contribution to the sound, and the kitchen was full of it. The laughing, the warmth, the lamplight, the family that had been built out of a bleeding man in a doorway and a woman who had decided to let him in. In the spring of 1890, Etta stood in the doorway of her house on a morning that was very much like the morning James had first arrived. Gray light at the eastern edge, the world still dark and quiet, the air carrying the green smell of new season. Robert was 8, sleeping still, and Clara Ruth was 4, also sleeping. James was behind her in the kitchen making coffee, and she could hear the sounds of that, the familiar domestic music of a shared life. She looked out at the 40 acres, her 40 acres, the fence that James had repaired again and again, always willing to fix whatever the winters broke. The garden, larger now, more productive, planted with the knowledge of nearly a decade of trial and adjustment. The barn James had substantially rebuilt 2 summers ago with help from Torres and Prout, in a weekend of cooperative labor that had ended in a supper that kept people at the table, until well past dark. The paddock where Copper, older now, moved slowly in the morning light, and where Robert's spotted pony was beginning to show signs of waking. James came to stand behind her and she felt his warmth along her back, and he rested his chin briefly on the top of her head before she turned to look up at him. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He handed her the first cup of coffee, which he always did, which she had come to understand was not a small gesture but a daily recommitment to a practice of care. She took it in both hands and felt the warmth of the cup and the warmth of the man and the warmth of the morning coming up behind the hills. "I was thinking," he said, "we should add on to the east room before winter. I was thinking the same thing, she said. Another room. We are going to need it, she said, and over the edge of the coffee cup she watched his face do the thing it did, the still moment, the deep register, the bright eyes. Etta, he said. March, I think, she said. Or April. He took the coffee cup gently from her hands and set it aside and turned her toward him and kissed her in the doorway in the spring morning light. And she kissed him back with everything in her, all of it. The stubbornness and the love and the years of building. The past that had been survived and the future that was opening like the Kansas morning in front of them, enormous and full of light. Their third child, another son, was born in April of 1891. They named him Henry, and he arrived with so much energy and so much immediate presence that the doctor shook his head and said he had never seen a baby so clearly certain about its own existence. Robert, who was 9 and had achieved a kind of older brother authority, inspected his new brother with serious attention. Clara Ruth, who was 5 and had decided that babies were primarily interesting as subjects for bossing, immediately set about informing baby Henry of the rules. James Sheridan, who had arrived bleeding on Etta Leland's porch with a wanted poster in his hand and a note with her name written on it, who had told her his dark past in the second sentence of their acquaintance and been given, against all reasonable expectation, a bed and a bandage and eventually a future, stood in the back bedroom with the east-facing window and held his third child and looked at his wife and understood, with the completeness that only comes from having once had nothing. What he had been given, the warrant was gone. The past was not erased. He would not have wanted it erased because the past was part of the shape of him, and the shape of him was what had found its way to this specific doorstep on that specific morning. But it was resolved, settled, no longer chasing. He had given his full testimony. He had made what restitution was within his power. He had built what he could on the foundation of better choices, and the building was real. This farmhouse, this land. This woman who had seen him bleeding and calculating risk in the gray pre-dawn and had made the only decision she could live with. This family, noisy and immediate and entirely, irreducibly his. He thought about the boy he had been at 22, broke and directionless in a Texas winter, making the worst choice of his life. He thought about the man who had ridden away from the farmstead near Abilene and told himself for too long that standing by was not the same as participating. He thought about the 18 months of running north, of honest work and no fixed point, of being useful without being anywhere. And then the 3 days' ride to Caldwell, the bleeding arrival, the woman at the door with a rifle and no inclination toward foolishness, and a quality of judgment that he had not encountered in years of encountering people. A quality of seeing past the surface to the actual thing, the actual person. He looked at Etta. She was watching him hold Henry with the expression she had when she was feeling something large and had decided to feel it fully rather than manage it into something smaller. He knew that expression now the way he knew the farm, by the way he knew Kansas winters intimately, with respect, with gratitude for the privilege of knowing it at all. What are you thinking? She said that I am the luckiest man in Kansas, he said, possibly in the country. You worked for it, she said. We both did. Yes, he agreed, but I needed the door to be open. She smiled, and it was the full smile, the one she gave him and the children and very occasionally the horses, the one that lived all the way through her. It was always going to be open, she said. I just needed to know who was on the other side. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, Henry between them in the crook of his arm, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he pressed his lips to her hair, and outside the window the Kansas spring was doing what Kansas springs do, opening up into an extravagance of light and sky and impossible distance. The horizon a promise and the land beneath it already green, already growing, already, unmistakably, home.